Hello, welcome to video 4. This is a short video out of 8 on the very basics of how to sew. So in this video we're going to be looking at the regular seam, which looks like this. So this is what we're about to sew in this video. So everything that I use, by the way, I'm going to find a link for it online so that you can find it somewhere and link it below. So for the regular seam, first we'll go over some very basics of actual sewing. This applies whether you're on a machine or you're hand sewing. So the first thing to remember is that sewing, you sew something basically inside out. So by the time you've finished, the neat side faces out. So this is the neat side of what I'm wearing. This is the neat side. And this is the bad side. So when we're sewing, we're basically sewing something so it's inside out, and then we're going to flip it round so that the neat side is out. So for the regular seam, and for a lot of, probably most seams, you want to sew good side to good side. So you always need to remember good side to good side. So when I was sewing this, orange is the good side. I put the two orange sides together, sewed it, and then that produces this seam. So whenever you're stuck, whenever you're mixed up, whenever you're doing complicated seams in some way, just remember good side to good side, and you can't get mixed up. So the next thing to talk about is thread. So the thread that I use, I think everybody should use, and that's Gutterman thread. No reason to ever use any thread other than Gutterman thread. So you can easily get 100 meters of thread for 20 pence if you want to, but if you do that, then that thread might be weak. Also, when you wash it, it might lengthen, which ruins your entire garment. It might shrink randomly, which ruins your entire garment. So if you get this, then I think pretty much everyone in the world uses this, and it's for a reason. So I definitely recommend Gutterman thread only when you're using thread. And then a second thing to mention is your needle. So when you're using your needle on a machine, when you're hand sewing, this doesn't really make a difference. So when you're on a machine, the needle does make a difference that you use. A, the sharper it is, the better, but B, if you're using a heavy needle with a very light fabric, then what can happen? It might leave very big holes in the fabric, and also it might, as it punches through, it can sort of bring the fabric in, so it either rips the fabric or it sort of gathers it in a little bit, creases it as it goes through the fabric. And then if you use a light needle on heavy fabrics, then the light needle can struggle. And what you don't want is the needle to fail to penetrate the fabric, because that's devastating for the needle and might even damage your machine. So those are the basics before we sew. So on to the actual sewing, you need to have a plan for what you're going to do with your raw edges afterwards. Okay, so this is the raw edge of the inside of this seam. So you can either leave it raw, which for many fabrics, like felt for example, that's completely fine. You can leave it raw. You can overlock it, which is what most people do, but beginners won't have the ability to do because you need a special machine. Or you can do one of the upcoming 4 seams that I'm going to look at. So all of those seams, they hide the raw edge inside the seam itself as you sew the seam. So you don't have to worry about finishing the raw edge. It's already taken care of for you. So that's what you need to consider before you sew, is what are you going to do with the raw edges. So once you know what you're going to do with the raw edges, then let's look at the actual seam. So this is just the regular seam. This is what people will assume you're going to do, unless specified otherwise. So the regular seam is it's a weak seam. There's a single line of stitching. It's the weakest seam that you can get. It's actually fine for almost every seam, for the purposes of an actual seam, right? So here, if I pulled that, the seam is not weak. It's not a weak seam in terms of daily wear. But if you want a particularly strong seam, then you don't want to use this. So for example, the crotch seam on trousers, jeans, joggers, etc., you often want that to be much stronger than the regular seam. So the regular seam is the weakest seam, but it's also the easiest seam to sew. As long as you don't need to take care of the raw edges, or you know what you're going to do with it, the regular seam is the easiest seam to sew, because you literally just put the fabric together and sew it. It's good for curves, very good for curves, and you just need to remember that it's good side to good side, and you sew, and that's it. Okay, so now we will look at an example of sewing the regular seam. So this is what the seam looks like that we're about to sew. It's actually the seam that I did in the last video for pressing. So I'll show you a regular seam. Sewing this, and then after that we'll do another regular seam, but we'll do it on an outside curve and an inside curve, so that you can see what to do when you get to those. So we'll start with our regular seam on the straight. So 1.5 centimeters is this line here. So this is only if you're doing machine sewing. If you're hand sewing, then this would be a back stitch. So all I'm going to do is just sew this regular seam. So when you're beginning a seam, you always need to secure it somehow. So some people go forward and backward, some people do a locking stitch, which is what I've just done. So as long as it's secured in place, it doesn't matter what you do. And then I'm just going to sew so this line stays at 1.5 centimeters, and as long as that happens, then our seam will be fine. And then we also need to finish the stitch at the end as well. So once we've done our stitch, which if you are hand sewing, then you'll need to learn the stitches from my hand sewing videos. So once we've done them, then we'll be left with something that looks like this. So remember, we did good side to good side, but we've got an amateur looking finish on the seam at the moment. And then the other side will look like this. So what we're going to do now, as you'll remember from the previous video, is press this open, and then it will look like a very professional finished seam rather than an amateur one. But before we do that, we're also going to sew the curved seams on these. So we're going to have the same 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. And we're going to sew along here, but as we sew, we need to move the fabric so that when it's level with the needle, it remains 1.5 centimeters away. So it doesn't matter where it is here, it's about where it is where it's level with the needle. So I'll just move this slightly. So when it's level with the needle, it needs to be 1.5 centimeters away here when you're sewing on the curve. And then Same for the outside curve, the exact same principle applies. So once this is a seam, and it looks like this, I actually don't know what this will look like once it's turned the right way out because it's just an example, but this seam isn't going to be very happy, as you can see, because the inside fabric has got too much fabric in it. So it's either not allowing this to stretch out, or it's sort of stretching it out too much. So what we need to do is make cuts. So what we're going to do for the cuts is this fabric needs to be a different size on this seam allowance to here, so that it can fold in on itself well. So the way that we do that is by cutting small triangles, and what you want to do is go almost to the stitching but not to the stitching. So if you go to the stitching, you're obviously going to have a hole in your finished garment, so you just need to go almost to the stitching. So you can do these notches wherever you fancy, but as a general rule, the sharper this curve is, the more notches you need to do. So if this is very sharp, you might want to do full triangles at the very peak of a curve, or if it was only quite gradual, then you only have to do cut a few triangles out. And then with an inside curve, this will need to be a different, again, same principle but the opposite. So it needs to be a different size for when this is turned the other way. So the way that we do that is just, well, the way it's often done is just to cut straight lines in it, and then it can move about by itself. So again, the sharper this curve is, the more lines you'll want to make. So where it's only gradual, you won't need to make as many lines as where it's a sharper curve. So as with all seams, we're now going to press it. So this is what it looks like pre-pressing. I'm still going to use my greaseproof paper because I haven't actually tested this fabric. So just place it on there nice and calmly and slowly. It's up to you how much weight, how much pressure you want to actually put down on it. And then once you're happy with it, flip it over and do the good side. Again, make sure this surface can handle the heat, and make sure your fabric can handle the heat. That's what that looks like, perfectly professional looking seam. Once you've pressed your seam and it's looking good, then you can call your seam finished, and remember just to press the seam before you do another seam that goes over that seam. So the regular seam, we'll recap, is the easiest seam to actually sew. It's very good for curves, both inside and outside curves. You just need to remember to cut those triangles or cut the lines in it so that it can actually freely fit inside its own curve after you've sewn it. And then you'll need to put it over a curved surface of some kind. You'll have to, I use the towel, and then I would unfold this and put it into a very tight small cylinder for doing those curves, because they were tiny curves. So yeah, you can do curves very well with a regular seam, but it's the weakest seam. It's fine for almost every seam, but when you do need a strong seam, it's not fine. You'd want to use a stronger seam, and of course it doesn't actually hide your raw edges. So if I made this into a garment, then over time these raw edges here would well, they would look far worse than this over time. So those are the things to consider when doing the regular seam. So in the next video, what we'll be doing is the half flat felled seam, which is an incredibly strong seam and it's very quick to do. So it does take longer than the regular seam that we just did, but of course it finishes your seam, your raw edges for you. So it saves time in that respect. So that's the next seam that we're going to be looking at in video, I think it's 5.